Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Season 4 of Itasca Waters' Practical Water Wisdom series, which focuses on issues related to water and ways to resolve those issues. My name is Hillary Sorensen. I'm the Water Resources Extension Educator with Minnesota Sea Grant, and I'm filling in today as your host for Brian Whittemore. Today's episode is called Minnesota Ice Out Forecast for 2025. Itasca Waters is a nonprofit volunteer organization headquartered in Itasca County, Minnesota, for the purpose of educating folks about the value of clean water for the environment and the economy. We offer a ton of good information for full and part-time residents through our programs, and it's all available on our website, itascawaters.org. I'd like to thank these partners who have been with us all along for helping Itasca Waters offer our Water Wisdom series. Excuse me. A little bit of housekeeping next. John Downing will speak to us for about a half hour and then take your questions. To submit a brief question, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question in. You can do this at any time during today's program, and we will read the questions on your behalf. Today's program is being recorded and will soon be available on our website, itascawaters.org. As we mentioned, for the subject today is Minnesota's Ice Out Forecast for 2025. And our expert presenter is Dr. John Downing, who is the director of the Sea Grant College Program, a research scientist at the Large Lakes Observatory on Lake Superior, and a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. So let's get to it. With that, here is John Downing.
Are you seeing that, Hillary?
Looks great, John.
Oh, that's perfect. Thanks. And thanks everybody for coming today. This is something that I really love to do. Something that we started some years ago. I put this slide up again with a picture of my little dog's feet on some beautiful cracked ice, which was safe. I would never put the dog on unsafe ice. But anyway, I just put it up here so that you could see my email address. So if you have any questions about ice out, or anything like that, in fact, any kind of question about water and what it means to you and what it means to the state, or how you can deal with water issues, feel free to drop us a message at my last name, Downing, at umn.edu. Be glad to hear from you. I also wanted to add my thanks to a series of people here. To Hillary, thanks Hillary for jumping in. I was Bill Granches might be here, we're not really sure, and Carrie and Rose are in background giving us some help with the Q&A, and I really appreciate everybody's help. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. We've had actually lots of feedback on the ice out clock, and it really wouldn't have been possible without these three people. These are people who work for Minnesota Sea Grant, or Jane did. She's not working with us now, sadly, but she's doing some other fun stuff. Jane Reed did a lot of the background programming. John Emmer dug data out of various data sets, and Murray Toms, of course, made it all happen through the communications unit of the Minnesota Sea Grant College program. Before we get going, I'd like to just say a few words about Sea Grant. Minnesota Sea Grant's a partnership of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that comes out to the acronym NOAA. You may hear of NOAA quite a bit because there are a lot of places in our lives, and it's a partnership with the University of Minnesota, both University of Minnesota in the broad sense and University of Minnesota Duluth. And what we do is we serve Minnesotans who need water science, and we provide accessible research data to industry, to leaders, to policymakers, educators, community organizations, municipal governments, university stakeholders, and citizens of all ages, and any community members of all ages, in fact. And if the science doesn't exist, then we get it built, we fund it to ensure it gets to those who need that water science. Water, to me, is, of course, because I'm a water scientist, or I'm actually, because I'm a human being, water is the most important resource that I can imagine for us. The focus areas, we have 5 focus areas in Minnesota Sea Grant, and they are healthy coastal ecosystems, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, or fish farming, resilient communities and economies, environmental literacy and workforce development and marine commerce. And this particular webinar kind of falls into some of the resilient communities and economies and environmental literacy and workforce development. And we do a whole lot of things across the entire state of Minnesota. We're a system-wide program of the University of Minnesota, and we have offices in Duluth and St. Paul. So now, why do I care about this, or why should you care about this? When I was a kid growing up in Minnesota, ice out seemed to me to be pretty narrowly focused, that you pretty much knew when the ice was going to go off of the lake. And maybe I should say at this point that ice out is when a lake basically gets fully cleared of ice, that most or all of the bays are clear of ice as well. But it used to be pretty narrow, sort of in the northern part of the state, where what the area I was super interested in, it seemed to be about May 1st, plus or minus a week. Incredibly, it really seems to have increased in variation. So, and this is really important because it's the dividing line between water sports in Minnesota and the winter lake sports like ice fishing, skating, snowmobiling, skiing, and that is divided from the summer lake sports like boating, kayaking, canoeing, fishing, water skiing, swimming, diving, you name it, by the departure of the ice in the springtime. And as I said, it used to be, at least my sense was, it was fairly narrowly timed because its climate just seemed to be a little bit more constant in the past. Well, now ice out seems to have become more variable. And if you look at this big blue histogram, this is like 14,000 lake years of data or observations of ice out in Minnesota lakes and when it occurred compared to the average for that particular lake. And I think you can see really easily that it spreads basically now over about 9 weeks in the state of Minnesota. So the start of the open water season varies by about 9 weeks. And if you think about that compared to the entire ice-free season, that's about another 2/3 of a 3-month ice-free vacation season. So that's a really kind of a huge deal. And so it is a pretty great concern to recreationalists like myself, people who want to know when they can open up the cabin and stuff. But it's also really important to the tourism industry. And this is another reason it's important, not just because we want to know when the boat goes in, but tourism worldwide is really one of the fastest growing industries in the world. And it accounts incredibly for about 10% of the global GDP. And the biggest problem identified by tourism is, of course, forecasting seasonality. When does the season begin? When does it end? How long is it in? And how good is that particular season? It is probably, and there's a lot written on this, probably the most important problem that tourism has to solve. And you can think about this if you're running like a hotel or something. You got to decide when you're going to get the big bump in accommodations. When do you have to have the rooms ready? How do you have to change your staff size in order to accommodate people? And if you think of the restaurant industry, they have to decide when to bring in perishable items to be supplied. When do they have staff? Transportation industry is another area it's really important to. And we all know, those of us who sometimes travel between the Twin Cities and the northern part of the state, how incredibly the traffic will vary from the ice-free season to the winter season. So it's also important for cultural services, places like museums and so on, to know when they're staffed and when they need to be open. It's important to entertainment, to rental and insurance, to retail. Even security and law enforcement need to know when they need to staff up or be extra vigilant or put on hours to make sure that the people who arrive are cared for in an appropriate way. And there are, of course, a lot of effects on supply chain. So I hope that you're convinced that this is an important thing to do. Now, it's also important for lakes. And the difference between a short ice season and a long ice season is pretty big. And let's look at a short ice season. That is to say, very early ice out, like we had last year. You get warmer spring and summer water. You have different kind of stratification. Stratification is, you may have noticed, it gets cooler in the summer as you go down in the water. It can get deeper and sort of more stable in under early ice out. There's greater oxygen demand just because things are living and warmer and using up more of that life-limiting gas. There's less ice scour and bottom freezing, taking out various things like aquatic plants. They're more in different kinds of algae and water plants, and you can actually lose the cool water species to the warmer water species. And also, there's great concern that early ice out will lead to the spread of aquatic invasive species, changes the phenology of our systems, and a lot of chemical changes too. Under long ice out, of course, you get kind of the opposite. You get cooler water, a rapidly changing water temperature. Stratification may not, in fact, be as strong or as deep. Oxygen demand may be lower. Plants can get scoured from shallows by deep ice. Cool water species are favored, and warm water species of fish, for example, not so much. And you tend to, in our area, sustain that historical biota, or the kinds of things that live in our water bodies. So not only has importance to people, but importance to those systems that we really love here in Minnesota. Now, Minnesota Lakes Ice Out 2025, we have a new and improved tool, and I hope some of you have used it already. And if you just go on into your browser and type in Minnesota Lake Ice Out Clock, it should come up pretty fast. The improvements that we've made are a few. Well, first off, we added in those data from 2024 that were just crazy. I don't know if you were around here at this time of year last year, you would have seen a really different thing with respect to the weather and climate. Almost no snow, really warm. Freeze up was weak, and ice was thin, etc. So we updated our database, and so the database has got something like 15,000 observations in it of ice out in various lakes, and then we updated that with the weather data. We've updated the forecasts, and they're refreshed daily, and we also set them so that they'll start on January 1st. Now, you may think that's crazy to start on January 1st trying to figure out when the ice is going to go out. But in fact, they're pretty strong because, and I'll come to that later, but the amount of freezing weather we've had matters quite a bit. Now, this year, unlike last year, we're using all of the 5 most important drivers of ice out, like how much freezing weather has there been, how much melting weather has there been, how big is the lake, what is the lake latitude, and I'll come around to that, the why on that in just a little bit, and seasonal snowfall, which is important too. The improvement to the tool is you can look up any lake you want, anytime you want, as long as it's over 100 acres. We sort of had to cut this off at some size. And besides, those little lakes are really hard to forecast because they have a big perimeter compared to their size. They get a lot of water flowing in from outside, and they can be really difficult to forecast. But as long as your lake is over 100 acres, you can probably go on this and figure out exactly what the forecast would be for your lake. That doesn't mean it uses just the data from your lake. It uses all of the data that have been observed over a long period of time. And this also, the tool this year is providing forecasts that are adjusted for total seasonal snowfall. And any of you who used it last year basically said, I would say something like, well, if it's a snowy year, you add some days and so on. But this, we give you a little bit more precise calculation with respect to what it will be depending on the overall accumulation of snow. And down at the bottom, you can see how you can find it. It's pretty easy, or you can click on that QR code, which I'll give you a bunch more times. Now, winter and spring conditions vary really a lot. This is one of my favorite places, and I have Internet of Things kinds of cameras out there watching ice because I really like the concept of ice and so on. You can see what that place looked like in 2023 on the left. Here's what it looked like about this time of year in 2024, and here's what it looked like a couple of days ago. And so you can see the conditions for a given time of year are quite divergent. Now, you may have noticed that we get a lot of extreme ice out years, and we're seeing this. These are for northern Minnesota lakes, but same could be said for southern Minnesota. There have been a lot of years when we've had pretty early ice out, and a lot of years when we have had late ice out. Last year, you'll see 2024 was one of our record years. A lot of records for ice out were broken last year simply because there wasn't much ice and it was a pretty warm winter. Now, I'm going to answer a couple of questions. One, what is ice out, which I've already alluded to, but also why that ice clears out fast. But I wanted to show you this quick video. This is a time-lapse video that I took that covers 31 days in about 48 seconds. So you can see how this works, and I'll try and tell you what's going on as we go. So what you're seeing here is kind of winter, and down at the bottom is the date. This was March, a little bit later than now in 2021. You're seeing the weather varying. You're beginning to see a shore lead. That's water around the edge, and that water around the edge indicates that water is either flowing in or you're getting melt of the ice near the edge of the lake because it's thinner near the edge of the lake. Now, here we've got some flows, a big shore lead. Those flows begin to rattle back and forth as they get pushed by the wind. And when they really get dynamic, they'll start to smash into each other, break each other up. And then once ice out starts, it just goes like crazy. And it goes really, really fast. Now, the reason it goes really fast is, ice out first. Ice out is when all principal bays of a lake are free of ice. Sometimes you can have a little bit left over. But the reason it goes out so fast is once the ice is gone, the lake begins to mix from top to bottom really fast. And it may surprise you, but the water at the bottom of a deep lake in northern Minnesota is the same temperature in the winter as it is in the summer, approximately. So down at the bottom, you have pretty warm water compared to the surface water. And that is because water doesn't behave like almost all other liquids. It's kind of miraculous in that regard. But the water down at the bottom is at a temperature of about 40 degrees year round. And then once you start mixing that lake top to bottom, that warm water comes up to the top and melts out the ice really quickly. My wife and I last year got to sit and watch the last vestiges erode away at the edge of one of the bays in the lake that we like to go to. And it's surprising how fast you begin to lose that ice. Oops, let me pass by that one if I can. Okay, now lots of things cause lake ice to melt faster or slower. Long, intense, warm periods, of course, which I call thawing degree days, and make it go faster. That's not surprising, right? Long, cold winters, what I call freezing degree days, make it go slower, go out slower. The size of the lakes makes it slow down. Bigger lakes go out, have their ice go out slower than littler lakes. And also latitude causes changes in the sun's angle, and I'll talk about that in, I think, the next slide. And deep snow cover also has an effect. And then there are lots of other things. A lot of wind, if you have pouring rain or streams flowing in. At deeper lakes, the depth of the lake makes some difference, but we don't have a lot of really great data across the lake on average depth of lakes. But those top 5 bullets are the ones that we pay attention to in this tool. Now, why don't I just talk about temperature or something? And why do I talk about strange things like thaw degree days and freezing degree days? I think that's illustrated, I hope, by this little graphic. I got out an ice cube and I left it out for an hour. I got out an ice cube and I let it sit there for 10 minutes. It takes time and exposure to warm weather to melt ice It takes time and exposure to cold weather to freeze ice and thicken ice. So that's why that cumulative temperature is important. And we measure it, as I said, by freezing degree days, FDD. It measures the time and intensity of freezing, and that drives a bunch of factors. And just as an example, 100 freezing degree days is 10 degrees at an average of 22 degrees in Fahrenheit, which means a low of 12 and a high of 32, something like that. There are lots of ways you can come to that same number. Thawing degree days measures the time and intensity of thawing, and an example would be 100 thawing degree days is 10 days at an average temperature of 42. And one way to get to an average temperature of 42 is to have a low of 32 and a high of 52. So you can kind of get a sense of what it takes in terms of cumulative temperature to freeze and melt lakes. Let's look under the hood for a second. Models in the clock are day-by-day multiple regressions. This is a little nerdy statistical stuff that forecast ice out day for all Minnesota lakes. The variables that we use are lake size in acres, latitude, the amount of freezing weather, and the amount of thawing weather received so far this year. And we measure freezing from October 1st and thawing from January 1st. And then we look at total seasonal snowfall. The analysis we have here, as I said, is a historical analysis of these 5 kinds of data. And I've explained them all: freezing weather, thawing weather, snow cover. This is total winter accumulation. But I will say that heavy snow cover does a bunch of things. It insulates the ice on the lakes, adds to ice thickness by the accumulation of what's called snow ice at the surface, and the white color reflects sun's energy. Lake size, I've talked about, and how far north. Minnesota's like 400 miles tall. So that covers almost 3 degrees of latitude. And the sun in the south gets higher in the sky than the sun in the north for a given date. And so it has an effect. And I should say here that the data come from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. That's a lake ice out dates. Also, lake latitude and lake size come from DNR. And the weather data come from the National Weather Service, which is a division of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they date back to about 1963-64, and we have really a lot of data. Now, I want to go into a couple pieces of science, and maybe you don't care, but just bear with me for a second here. As I said, snow depth makes a big difference. It makes that snow ice, you see at the top of that big chunk of ice that's about like 20 inches long, and about 6 or 8 inches of it are made up of snow ice. It insulates the ice, it reflects heat. And actually, it adds about 2 days per foot of ice to the delay in ice out. So per foot of snow. So in those years you get 4 feet of snow, let's say, it's going to change ice out by about 8 days. The sun's angle, or its azimuth, matters because the sun is higher in the south than in the north, and it adds about 3 to 5 days per degree of latitude. And 1 degree of latitude, we don't think about that all the time because we just think about where we are in Minnesota, but 1 degree is a little bit more than the distance between Hinckley and Duluth. Again, the images here come from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Oh, and this is just another nerdy bit here. This is just showing you that between Albert Lea and International Falls, the difference in the sun's azimuth at about this time of year is like 6 degrees, and that's kind of a lot. So you can understand this graph by this is you looking south, and this is how high in the sky the sun is at different times of the year. This is summer solstice up here, and this is winter solstice, 21st of December. And we're about here, but the difference at this time of year between Albert Lea and International Falls is something like 6 degrees. You might want to know how much thawing it takes to normally to melt a lake. And if you're interested in those kinds of data, it runs about, on average, about 260 thawing degree days. And we rarely get any ice out by 135, and you can see those data, and I'll show you that in a second on the ice out clock if that interests you. Now, forecasting in 2023 was at one extreme, huge snow depth and a below average forecast for temperature. These are from NOAA and Department of Natural Resources. 2024 was last year. You can see there was almost no snow on the left, and the weather outlook was warm. This year we're a little bit in between those two areas, so we have a little snow, and that snow depth map isn't adjusted for what happened a few days ago. These come out on Thursdays from the climate office at the DNR, so probably it'd be have a little bit more snow down in this area and a little up here, but more down in the sort of the middle metropolitan area and so on. It's pretty deep. But the temperature outlook now from NOAA is looking at pretty warm temperatures. So you can take that into account as you think about ice out on lakes. Predicting the future is hard, and that's probably why limnologists and lake scientists don't do it very much. Meteorologists do it, and they take a lot of criticism if they're ever wrong. But our ice out clock now automatically adjusts forecasts every day so you can keep updated. And they take in that data on lake size and latitude from DNR. They measure data from the National Weather Service, bring those in every day updated. And then we give a forecast for a range of total seasonal snowfall. Why seasonal snowfall? It's because, it surprises me, but even in Minnesota, the cumulative snow depths are really not available. It's really hard to get those data, so we kind of have to make some adjustments for snow. So here's what the ice out clock, the homepage, looks like, and again, you can find it with that QR code or just Google it. It's really easy to find. The introductory page has some information on how it works and what you can do with it, and also about this webinar. The next page talks about how to use it, and I'll show you how to use it in just a second. You may want to open it up on your screen instead of looking at me and my slides. And what you do first is you choose your county now, and you do that with a drop-down menu. I, of course, am super interested in Itasca County, as is Itasca Waters, so I put in Itasca County most of the time. And then what you do is use that drop-down to choose your favorite lake, or whatever lake you're interested in, or whatever lake has an ice out pool going that you're interested in. And then what you do is you click on Get Ice Out Forecast down here by that big red arrow, and this is what you get. So you'll see if there's low snow, which I think is pretty indicative of this year, or high snow or average snow, you'll get a forecast. And it's surprising to me that they don't vary a lot, but that is because the effect of snow is important, but it isn't as strong a driver in the springtime as is thawing weather. So that is how you use that tool. It should be really simple. You can also actually go onto the map of Minnesota if you don't remember the names of counties, and click on the county, and it'll fill it in for you, which I think is really convenient. And then if you're interested in looking at the fine print, that is down here at the bottom. You can see the freezing degree days, which is a driver, again, of ice thickness and temperature. And you can see the thawing degree days. And for this lake that I'm really interested in, it's only had 9 thaw degree days this year. And it usually takes, as I said a second ago, something like 260 on average to melt it. So it's got a ways to go, but you can have a look at this and see how close you're getting really to those numbers if that interests you too. And also you can look up, and you'll see guidance on this on the clock itself, what the actual accumulated snow has been, and so you can make some guesses about where you are in this overall range. That's just what I just said, verbally the same distribution. If we're down here at 9 thawing degree days, you can see very few lakes have actually lost their ice across Minnesota at that low low an amount of thawing weather. But when you get up here into the 200 range, it gets to be about half. And then certainly by the time you've had about 500 thaw degree days, almost all lakes in all years has had ice out. So here's what the models are forecasting for, well, today. I said today, it actually was yesterday because I knew I was going to be traveling all night, basically. These are forecasts for about 2,000 acre lakes. That'd be like Lake Albert Lee is one that I have in here. There, I think I put White Bear Lake for St. Paul area. I'm not sure, but you can do it yourself and figure it out. But here's what we're seeing right now is these are low snow forecasts because we really haven't had that much despite the snow that we had in the last little while. So we're looking at for southern Minnesota for a lake of that size, you're looking at, 10 days from now, basically, potentially. A little bit more over here in the west part of the state. And clearly, as we move north, those dates get later and later, getting up into mid-April around Mille Lacs. And for the very northerly lakes, and of course, they're even later up toward International Falls. One interesting thing about this is that the lakes over here in Cook and Lake County counties tend to go out a little quicker, and that has to do with the warming effect of Lake Superior, we think. So, but again, everything depends on weather. Everything could change. We could get 5 feet of snow. It could get extremely cold, or it could get up to 70 degrees and stay there for a couple of weeks, and things would change. The warmer weather would speed it up, and the colder weather and snow would tend to slow it down. Shallow lakes and those with big watersheds or large stream or river inputs are going to be faster. If you drive up 35, you'll see the Snake River is starting to open up in places, and high winds can accelerate this. So I hope you have fun with that tool. I have had fun with it, and I get a lot of comments if I mention what I do in various stores. Everybody's got an opinion on it, and we spend a lot of time. I sometimes am late getting home because I find people who are interested in it, and I, of course, can't resist talking to them about it. Now, here are some things that you can do to help make better future forecasts. As I mentioned, one of the big issues we have is having really accurate and complete snow depth reporting. And there's a snow depth reporting program that you can get into at weather.gov, and the link, the URL is right there. Also, if you have a home weather station, you can connect that up to the National Weather Service, part of National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and add your data to the observations. And then another thing that's important that we're a little bit limited on is, well, you may think 15,000 observations that we're able to get from DNR is a lot, but on the other hand, we have 14,378 lakes in the state, and we can sure use more data, and it will make this tool more and more accurate as time goes on. So I would turn it back to Hillary, and I would be happy to, not just happy, but delighted to answer any questions. And also, pardon me, there's my email. Feel free to ask any questions by email if we don't get to them today. So Hillary, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Okay, it's time to get to the questions. Please submit your questions in writing by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using the chat function today. So I'll read the questions. John will answer them. We may need to combine some questions if they're very similar. And if we don't get to all of your questions today, as John mentioned, you can feel free to send him a direct email. I've also shared his contact information in the chat. Or you can also feel free to please email info@itascawaters.org after the program if you still have some unanswered questions. Okay, so let the Q&A begin. First, this is just a quick logistical one. This from Margot. How do I log into the clock?
Ah, Margot, I would suggest that the best way to get to it, you don't have to, there's no login. You don't have to sign up. But all you have to do is put into your browser Minnesota Ice Out Clock or something like that. Any combination of those words tends to find it. Or another way to find it really easily is go to the Sea Grant site, which is seagrant.umn.edu. And I think it's right on the home page. There's a link to get to the Ice Out Clock right now, I believe. So if you have any difficulty at all, let me know because we want to make it easy.
Thanks, John. I'll also share that in the chat in a minute too. Okay, second question. Is there any way the ice out clock could help predict ice thickness?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In fact, like I say, whenever people talk to me about the ice out clock, the question I get mostly is, how come you don't tell us when there's gonna be ice on the lake and how thick it is? And first off, let's deal with the first piece. When does the ice start on lakes? Well, that depends on so many things that it's super hard to forecast. And I've really tried, and it's just miserable. And the reason is it pretty much all depends on wind. Well, you get cold weather and it can be really, really cold. But if there are waves and turbulence in the water, it takes a lot of cold to get it to freeze. And the obvious example of that, of course, is Lake Superior that hardly freezes at all anymore. So that turbulence keeps that ice free. You can get super cooled water at the surface and then slow it down and it'll clank into ice, just kind of. But so that makes it tough. Ice thickness is another, it can be forecast. And I'll tell you, to be totally frank, the reason I don't do it is liability. I mean, I don't want to be, somebody to be hurt who goes out on the ice too early. Ice thickness is something. In fact, we've got a whole story on this in the Sea Grant website. Ice thickness can vary by 50% across a lake, and so one hole in the ice doesn't really tell you how thick it is everywhere. And I take extreme caution around ice that isn't really solid because hypothermia is, well, no way is a good way to die. Hypothermia is not a great one either. But thanks for that. I'd like to do that. I mean, it can be done. So sea ice thickness we can forecast with the same numbers. Sea ice is a different affair, right? But lake ice we should be able to forecast too, based on those FDD numbers, freezing degree days. And it's a pretty simple formula, but our lakes are so different, each one, that any forecast would not work for all of them. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, next question. What causes ice ridges to form, and how do they generate enough force to damage docks and push up shorelines?
Oh my gosh, I did some calculations on this. So if you have like a 10-foot by 10-foot ice, a piece of ice, ice flow that's maybe a foot thick and 10 feet by 10 feet, it weighs as much as a skid steer, like a small bulldozer. And that's a lot of mass. And when the wind blows across it, it transfers some of that wind speed into the ice, and it will move relentlessly. So if you've got, let's say, a 10-mile-an-hour wind, you're generating almost as much force as a small bulldozer. And so if it's coming in towards shore, it can push up almost anything in its way, just like a bobcat could. And it's because it weighs a lot. So I'm doing the second part of your question first, and then I'll get to the ice ridges. But it weighs a lot. And then the other thing that happens is ice fills your lake from shore to shore, and then the sun beats down on it. And when you put sun on anything, what does it do? It expands. So if you're looking at a mile stretch of ice and it gets warm, you're going to expand that many feet, and it has nowhere to go. So it has to kind of push up on the side, and that's what kind of pushes up on the edges. And of course, if you get really heavy winds and chunks of ice floating around, they are going to do a lot of damage. I've seen some at Mille Lacs. I've seen some incredible ice ridges there. Also on littler lakes. So the ice ridge, the ridges between bays, basically, is you get a fracture, and then you get the same effect as you have moving ice. It will come up and over one sheet, up and over another one. If one of them is fast or stuck to shore, and another one is moving, it'll come up like a bulldozer right over the top of that ice. It's very, very powerful stuff. If you've ever tried to stop a moving sheet of ice, don't. I mean, get away from it. It's amazing.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
It's pretty interesting. Okay. I like this question. How do ice out changes affect fish spawning cycles?
Yeah, now I've talked about this with our fisheries, one of our fisheries specialists at Minnesota Sea Grant, Don Schreiner, who also was super important to the fisheries on the North Shore. And fish are a little bit flexible in how they do stuff. I mean, there is an effect on phenology, right? But Don has said some fish species can actually spawn under ice. So, but of course, one of the big problems is, of course, if ice out is late, then the temperatures are cooler. And some of the discussions I've had with fisheries scientists I know suggest there's an issue. So let's say the fish spawns successfully, you get some little fry, they live off their yolk sac for a while, but then they've got to have food. And if you don't have the right food available for that fish at the time that it runs out of yolk from the fish egg, it's toast. So it can have a big effect if the food species just aren't there for it. And zooplankton that they eat have cycles that are dependent on temperature, like most other stuff. In fact, we have a webinar coming up in the Itasca Waters series on exactly this, on how variations in climate affect fish and fisheries. So, and I can't remember what month that is, but somebody can.
May, I believe.
May.
May.
Is that May? Okay. That should be quite a cool webinar.
All right, excellent. Is there a known effect on water clarity for ice, like erosion causing water turbidity, absorbing sunlight? Any effects on water clarity?
Yeah. Well, of course, if water is cooler, which is one of the effects of having late ice out, then it's going to not be able to grow much algae. Like most things other than warm-blooded animals like us, how fast they can do things depends on how warm it is or how cold it is. So what we call poikilotherms, or some people call cold-blooded, it's not necessarily true because they're hot-blooded when it's warm. I mean, but those things are really dependent on temperature. And so, yeah, algae would be one of those things. Now, another thing that ice does, if it gets really thick and stays there really a long time, is it'll freeze out some of the salts and chemicals that are in the water, and they can precipitate or turn into a kind of flocculent stuff and go to the bottom and not be soluble. And there have been some effects of that on lake water clarity that have been seen. However, if it goes out really early, then you've got a lot more warming days. First off, you start with warmer water in the spring, and you're probably going to have more warming, and you're probably going to have, well, let's say more rain and more nutrients coming in. And I think early ice out probably has a pretty big effect on water clarity, how fast those algae grow. And Jack Jones, a famous limnologist who lives in the Twin Cities and northern Minnesota, has this idea, and I think it's a really good one, that the stratification matters too. That if you get deep and stable stratification, which is what you can get under some ice out conditions, there's a concern that you may get, or shallower stratification, you get more mixing of water from the deep water, and that deep water mixing can lead to more nutrients that can cause more algae. So yes, it can have a lot of different kinds of effects. I don't think it's so much scouring per se, although they do. If you get a deep freeze of ice, you're going to take out those aquatic plants. Aquatic plants are terrific at taking up nutrients that can cause algae to grow. And if you don't have aquatic plants, you're probably going to get more algae, and the algae will change the water clarity. But thanks, and we're working on it, thinking about it a lot, and Jack and I have talked about that quite a bit.
Thanks, John. I know our July speaker, Chris Philstrup, has also given presentations on the link between ice cover, warmer water temperatures, and harmful algal blooms. So algae blooms that produce cyanotoxins. So he may speak to that a bit in July too.
Well, it's that temperature thing again, Hillary. It's the warmer that water is. There are some people who say blue-green algae like it hot, right? And so when it's warm, they tend to grow. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, can improvement in predicting ice out help mitigate environmental damage?
Say that again, would you, Hillary? Would you read that again?
So, can our improvements in predicting ice out help mitigate environmental damage?
Yeah, in a sense, this has to do with the tourism industry too. And I think there's a concern that if your summer season gets too compressed, let's say ice out is really late, there's a very big concern that everybody goes to the lake all at the same time instead of spreading that use out over a longer period of time. And when you have a lot of boat traffic and you have a lot of people there, and a lot of camping and things that come along with that, then you do tend to have some environmental changes, I think, that are driven by that. And certainly boat traffic itself is simply, if lakes that are more crowded and boats will tend to have more nutrients and have altered water quality. Yeah.
Next question. Like many lakes now in Minnesota, our lake has zebra mussels. Would a longer ice out, so more ice for a longer period of time, slow down reproduction of zebra mussels, assuming warmer water accelerates zebra mussel reproduction? But don't know that this is accurate.
I don't know if zebra mussels are very strongly driven by, to what degree they're driven or limited by temperature. There are some limits to where they can grow because of temperature and season length. So they don't go quite as far north as some of the other invasive species, but I'd have to defer. I'm really not sure about that, but it's certainly something to think about. We should ask Bill Granchis, or we can ask Nick Phelps or Dan Larkin. Others probably have studied that more than I have.
Yeah, I've heard some anecdotal evidence about the veligers, the pre-mussel form of the zebra mussels, and they do have impacts or effects from colder water temperatures, but I don't know the answer to that either.
I think in general, if you have colder conditions in winter, summer temperatures tend to be a little cooler too, and that could change it.
My internet is getting unstable. I might turn off my camera here for a second. Got just time for a couple more questions here. So, does the ice out clock use the National Weather Service data? How tailored is this data to the specific lake?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, to the National Weather Service. It's really the only source of this kind of data that we have. National Weather Service is important to virtually everything we do in forecasting or in anything having to do with people's security and safety. Yes, it uses National Weather Service data. And the second half was what, Hillary, again?
It was how tailored is the data used for the ice out clock to specific lakes?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So we had to take the data from the best source, which are airports. And so the closer a lake is to an airport, the better off the better the predictions, the forecasts. In fact, there's this really strange situation where we have Upper and Lower Red Lake actually are closer to completely different airports across the state. And these aren't big airports. It's not like we're not talking about MSP here. We're talking about Hibbing Airport and International Falls and others. Grand Forks is another one we use. But Red Lake, of course, one lake is closer to one weather station, the other lake is closer to another. So if you contrast those, you'll find that they have really different, they make different forecasts. So it does depend on how close a lake is to a weather station. I would love it if we had a denser weather coverage across the state. We could, the same equations probably work pretty well in the background, but we'd be able to drive them with more precise weather. If you put up your own weather station, send me an email and I'll give you the formulas and you can figure it out.
Thanks, John. Okay, maybe do one more question here. How do ice out dates impact wildland fire control? And is climate change making it more likely that lakes will remain frozen during critical firefighting periods?
You know, I not a firefighter. I do know as we get drier conditions, we will tend to have more wildfires. We're actually forecast to have a five-fold increase in wildfire in northern Minnesota by about 2050. So but that's drying conditions, and wildfires, although some burn all year long, tend to be in the drier parts of the year, which would be later in our region. So I think it doesn't have much relationship yet, but it could, and if and there just aren't, broad relationships between how much precipitation we get in a year and how cold the winter was. So I think it's probably pretty unrelated, but though it is all related to how dry our seasons are. So drought is a serious issue with respect to the wildfire. And Chris Philstrup at the Natural Resources Research Institute is looking at the effect of wildfire on lake water quality, which my guess is it's pretty large. It's the same as it was looked at in New Hampshire and other places too. So yeah, I think it's unrelated, but it's all about this. It's the same kind of deal. It's all about what the weather is over a period. Yeah.
Thanks, John. All right, I lied. I'm going to squeeze in one more question here.
Okay, good.
Um, why don't lake scientists give us other kinds of forecasts? What kinds of forecasts might be possible?
Because they're chicken. No, it's, forecasting, like I said earlier, telling the future is hard, and you're often wrong, but meteorologists have gotten used to that, and we've gotten used to the weather not being forecast exactly correctly. And I think other things could be forecast really well. I mean, wouldn't it be good to know when you're going to have toxic algae blooms, be able to forecast that? And that would be driven by temperature and a bunch of other things. And wouldn't it be good just to know if the temperature will be too cold to put the kids in so their lips will get too blue? Being able to forecast that in advance. I think there are lots of other possibilities for forecasting. It's kind of a lot of work, but I think it'd be really useful. Things like forecasting water clarity so people understand what's driving water clarity. And by the way, there are more reasons than one for forecasting, and one is understanding what's driving it, right? So, I think what we talked about today is we know there are at least 5 things that have an effect on when the ice goes out. It's similar. We could learn other things about water clarity and water temp too. So, yeah, there are lots of good things. Thanks.
Thanks, John. All right. So, as we mentioned before, if you have any additional questions that come up after this, please feel free to contact John Downing directly. Contact information is in the chat, and or Itasca Waters at info@itascawaters.org. This program will be available soon on the Itasca Waters website. Please feel free to recommend it to family, friends, and neighbors. And also, we are asking for your ideas about the Water Wisdom series. So you can use the survey link on the screen, which I believe is here. Is it here? Yes. or the QR code to fill out an evaluation form that will be emailed to you. So yeah, we really appreciate any ideas and recommendations for future programs. Our next program will be on April 3rd and will feature Dr. Emily Fairfax, who will share about beaver dams, ponds, and effects. And you can register for free on the itascawaters.org website. So I'm Hillary Sorensen again. Thank you so much for watching today and hope to see you next time.